Are we ready to go? Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Jackie Galloway. I'm the CEO of Peninsula Community Legal Centre. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'm pleased to welcome you to this Elder Law Forum, which we're delighted to be presenting in collaboration with the City of Kingston. The Peninsula Community Legal Centre offers free legal services across Melbourne's southeast. We have a long and proud history working with the City of Kingston through our legal outreach services in Chelsea and the Westall Community Hub, as well as our duty lawyer services at the Moorabbin Specialist Family Violence Court. We are aware of the ongoing COVID situation has meant that some who wanted to attend in person today have been unable to do so. But fortunately, we're able to live stream the event and welcome those who are watching online. We've put together a program today which is projected on the screen, which focuses on some of the key legal issues facing people as they age. We are very pleased that the Commissioner for Senior Victorians and the Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention, Gerard Mansour, is here with us today. We're also delighted to welcome our speakers, John Corcoran AM from Russell Kennedy Lawyers, Meg Dowling from the ANZ Bank, and our own lawyer, Mr. William Betts. Will Betts will also be taking the role of MC today. We also have two of our PCLC colleagues, Angie and Kirsten, are here to answer any questions you may have. As you can see from the agenda, we will break at 11:25 a.m. for morning tea, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. A couple of housekeeping points before I hand over to the Mayor. We will provide legal information today, not legal advice. If you need legal advice on your individual situation, there are brochures over on the PCLC table with information on how to access our service. The bathrooms are on level 2 below us and can be accessed by the stairs or the lift. And with parking, the car park at the rear won't be monitored today, but please ensure that you haven't parked in the 1-hour parking bay on the service lane. We're really happy that you're able to join us. It gives me a great delight to hand over to the Mayor, Steve Stakos.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's Elder Law Workshop. The City of Kingston proudly acknowledges the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community members who might be here with us today. Council acknowledges the Bunurong's continuing relationship to the land and waterways and respects that their connection and spiritual identity is maintained through ancient ceremonies, songlines, dance, art and living culture. Council pays tribute to the invaluable contributions of the Bunurong and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders who have guided and continue to guide the work that we do. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the Commissioner for Senior Victorians, Gerard Mansour, the presenters who have volunteered their time to be involved in today's event, including John Corcoran from Russell Kennedy Lawyers and Meg Dowling from ANZ Bank, the Peninsula Community Legal Centre, who have partnered to make today's event happen, and all of the attendees who are here in person or who are watching live from the safety of their own homes. Council is delighted to work in partnership, once again, with Peninsula Community Legal Centre to deliver this free and important workshop. The workshop has been developed in response to increasing the awareness of elder abuse in our community. It is all of our responsibility to work together to ensure that older people in our community are protected from this crime. Older people can protect themselves by increasing their knowledge about their legal and financial affairs. And Council is committed to offering workshops and information sessions that empower all of our older community members to feel in control and to feel safe. In addition to today's workshop, Kingston Council offers a number of programs aimed at creating opportunities and connections for older residents. These range from training in computer literacy skills, providing free bus services, online exercise programs, and many more services. Our libraries provide an extensive list of workshops and training offerings, along with free access to computers and the internet. And every year we dedicate October to Kingston's Seniors Festival. We hope these activities will help to contribute to a sense of well-being for our older residents and foster positive connections for friendship. It is our hope that learnings from today's workshop will empower our residents to help them feel that they can help put a stop to elder abuse. It is now my honour and pleasure to call up our first speaker for the morning, and that is the Commissioner for Senior Victorians, Gerard Mansour. The Commissioner for Senior Victorians provides an independent advice and advocacy service to the Victorian Government and to the Victorian people on issues relevant to senior Victorians. The Commissioner also plays a key role in educating the community on seniors' issues, including the prevention of elder abuse. And importantly, the Commissioner promotes the positive contribution of seniors in our community. Gerard was appointed to the role in 2013. He is highly respected and a passionate advocate to the government on behalf of older people. We are very fortunate to have Gerard join us today, and it is my great pleasure to welcome him to speak. So thank you.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the Bunurong people as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways on which we're all meeting today. I'd like to also acknowledge them as the longest living civilisation in the world and how fortunate we are to be able to live on their land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Welcome everybody and those joining us online as well. Thank you for the very warm welcome, Jackie and Steve. I have great pleasure in my role to travel around a lot, and I'd like to acknowledge the enormously significant role that Peninsula Community Legal Centre do in providing support to people, not only older people, but to the community more broadly. And forums like this, I think, are a really important part of us all getting a better understanding about what we can hope to have and how to deal with challenges as we get older, but also to the Council. Council provides such significant support to older people in every community right across Victoria, whether it's access to premises, education sessions, providing support in so many different ways. So I'm delighted to be able to join you here today. I'd like to sort of open up by just making a reflection on where we are in life generally. Part of my role as a commissioner is to try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the lives of older people. And at the moment, it's a very different experience. There's a really wide continuum of experiences from older people. And for me, that starts from age 60 when people become eligible for their seniors card. So that's sort of the policy mandate that I have as a commissioner. And I know as I talk to lots of older people, some older people are amongst the first to have joined our community from COVID. They've already done their international trips or their trips around Australia, and they're out and about again. There's a big group behind them that are expressing some level of conservatism in some way. They're a little bit unsure about how safe it is to return to activities in the community. They're doing things like a number of people here wearing face masks and looking at, practical, safe ways that they can reconnect in a slow, progressive way. But there's also a third group that's on my mind as a commissioner, and they're the people that are represented by the vacant chairs that are here today. The people who aren't yet sure that they're confident enough to return to the community. And I think for that group of people, there's a couple of different issues at play. Sometimes it's a very reasoned decision. They've got underlying health conditions. They know that that puts them in a point of vulnerability. They've had their vaccinations, but they know for them there needs to be a level of conservatism about how they connect with our community. But I think there's also another group of people that I would say are overly conservative, that haven't yet found that magic balance for them, that they aren't quite sure about what are the circumstances that they want to see before they return to activities in the community. So I'd just like to share with you that we probably all know those sorts of people that fit in all those different categories. And I think for those of you that are here today and those that are joining online, you can be great advocates to do what lots of older people want to do, and is have those practical conversations, to actually talk about it and acknowledge, yeah, this is still an issue. You know, that for some of us, we're not quite yet ready to reconnect. I think through COVID, there has been, from the feedback I've received from older people, there's certainly been some positive experiences. I think I've heard from so many older people that they're now engaging with technology in a way that they hadn't done before. I've had a chance last year to attend a graduation ceremony of over 20 older people, all from non-English speaking backgrounds and all aged over 80 that were using Zoom for the first time, and so excited that they could actually do that. And the freedom that's now given them to connect with their loved ones, you know, across Australia and overseas. But of course there's been significant challenges too, hasn't there, around the whole impact of isolation. And for some of us, and I know I find this for myself from time to time, you've sort of got to push yourself a little bit to get back to life in a way. You know, sometimes there can be a comfort in just staying around the home. So I think there are some ongoing challenges that we've got to come to terms with. For me today, this is one of the really important practical things of life, is how we think about elder abuse. And so when we use that term, what are we actually talking about? And so as we all get older, at any age of our life course, we can all reasonably have an expectation to be treated with respect and dignity, can't we? It's like a core value in our society that all of us have an entitlement to be treated with dignity and respect. But when we use the word elder abuse or the phrase elder abuse, we're talking about the experience of the people that are close to us, the people that often we would regard as our trusted friends, our trusted family members, be the people in our lives that become the abusers for us. And so it's a little bit different when we talk about elder abuse. We're not talking about public scams. We're talking much more about an experience of abuse by people that are typically in our lives in some way. And today we'll unpack that in a little bit of detail for you. I'd just like to refer in the context to the fact that there are typically 6 types of abuse. So when we think about, okay, the trusted people that are in our lives, what are the experiences of older people that have abuse? The most common one, and the really important starting point for today, is financial abuse. And, you know, in a sense, that's essentially about money. You know, money or assets that we have that people take or access without our knowledge or our wishes. But there are other forms of abuse that are also very significant. There's emotional abuse. So what's that? Intimidation, humiliation, demeaning. You know, the people in our lives that don't use language that treats us with respect. So that's also a form of abuse. Social abuse, and this is one of the ones that I think can be a marker for us. And often in these forums talk about social abuse can be an indicator of something happening in someone's lives. Now, social abuse is represented by people being isolated against their wishes. And so think of the people in our lives that suddenly we don't have contact with anymore. A lot of the phone calls that I get as a commissioner are from a family member who says, I used to ring mum or dad every Tuesday or Wednesday and have conversations. But my brother has moved back in at home now, and for some reason the family's not hearing from my mum and dad anymore, and I'm concerned about what's happening in their lives. So not always, but sometimes isolation can be a proxy for there's something happening in that person's life that is not exactly what they would want. And so isolation can be an indicator that abuse is happening, and it also can be a risk factor. So the more that people are isolated, the less we have that broad group of trusted people in our lives, the higher our risk of abuse actually goes up. And it's one of the reasons that I acknowledged at the start of my conversation with you today, that I am concerned about people who, as we move forward, will be overly cautious in reconnecting. In the long term, that's not helpful for them. I think it's really important that everybody strikes and finds the balance of comfort. And if it means the comfort comes through wearing face masks, or only going to places where we're confident we can get our social distancing, or only going to groups where we know there's smaller numbers. There's lots of ways that we can put in place practical measures, because isolation and the consequence of isolation can be very negative for people, not only for their mental well-being, but also for the risks of things like elder abuse. The other forms of abuse that our mind tends to go to when we think about abuse are things like physical abuse or sexual abuse, or even forms of neglect. So neglect is where we have a need, we have the resources to meet that need, but somebody is blocking us getting access to maybe services or support. One of the very common ways that a perpetrator of abuse will continue to perpetrate that abuse is they'll block access not only to family and friends, but to other service providers, because that's what shines a light on what's happening to an older person's life. So one of the most important messages that I've got is that we all, as we move forward from here, look for positive and concrete ways to reconnect in our community in a way that we're safe. It's not only important for our mental health and our well-being, but it's also important for our protection against something like elder abuse. Another area that I just wanted to touch on and bring to our attention is that a lot of people over the last couple of years that have experienced the highest levels of isolation in order to protect them from the risks of COVID are people living in residential aged care. And a lot of my work in the last couple of years has been focused on trying to find the balance for people that are living in residential aged care to still have visitors and their family and loved ones coming to see them in a way that gives them a bounce and quality of life and support for their day-to-day living. But at the same time, finding a balance in protecting people at that same time from the risks of COVID. And I think as we go forward, lots of us in our community will live near a residential aged care facility, or will have friends and loved ones in a residential aged care facility. And if any of us are in that category, I'd really urge us to now start thinking about reconnecting. And it could be through a telephone call, it could sometimes aged care providers make available things like iPads, it could be through a visit. There's structured ways for visitors to now happen, provided we do a RAT test and things like that. But I think it's very important that we remember that people who live in residential aged care are still part of our community. And they're still people that we can reach out to and support. I think one of the challenges for us all is out of sight can be a little bit out of mind. And when someone moves into residential aged care, we don't pay the same effort as we might have had if they still remained in their own home. So a really strong reminder for us on behalf of all the Victorian citizens living in residential aged care, where we do have friends and loved ones that are in that environment, let's make sure that we continue to reach out to them in a positive and effective way. Just turning my mind back to elder abuse, one of the things that is always on people's mind is how widespread is elder abuse, and it's been a real challenge for us. But it's only in the last year that the Commonwealth Government released a report about the prevalence of elder abuse in our society in Australia. And because it was a national study, we can have some confidence that our experience here in Victoria is pretty much the same. And what it found was that 1 in 6 older people are actually experiencing some form of elder abuse. So it's not a small number. It is the minority. Well, that's the good news. You know, not all of us, the majority of us are going to go through our life without having the experience of elder abuse. But the challenge that we've got, if I look across this room today and we know there are around about 1 in 6 people, we don't know which 1 in 6 it's going to be. And so it's very sensible for all of us to treat this issue very seriously and to think about what are the steps that we can take to protect ourselves as individuals from the risks of elder abuse. And one of the most important ones is to know that support is available. That's the single most important thing, that we can reach out. We can pick up the phone and ring Peninsula Community Legal Centre. We could pick up the phone and ring the council and ask, you know, who is it that I could talk to in my local community? So there are pathways to support. Why do I stress that? Because the most astounding figure for me that came through the prevalence study was that at least 2/3 of older people who are currently living with abuse have not reached out for support. Now that could be a few things. Access, remembering there are around about 1 in 6 older people who will experience of those people at the moment, the vast majority, and the speakers that are going to, that support is available. And you don't have to be one of those 2/3 occur in our life. And all draw something positive from it, and I look forward to participating in the panel in a little while. Thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank Gerard for that very enlightening and important talk for us. My name's Will Betts. I'll be emceeing and talking a little bit later about wills and estates planning. Also, I'd like to thank the City of Kingston for having us and also pay my respects to our Aboriginal elders past and present and emerging. Next speaker that we have very lucky to have is John Cochrane. John is a principal and former chairman of Russell Kennedy Lawyers, very well respected and prominent Australian law firm. He's also a past president of the Law Institute of Victoria and past president of the Law Council of Australia. He's going to talk to us about retirement living options and options for seniors in that space. He has a lot of experience in that area and we're very happy to have him come speak to us today.
Thanks, Will, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it is an absolute pleasure to be down here well, I used to call this building the Moorabbin Town Hall, but when I arrived today it's now the Kingston City Hall. I'm glad I came to the right place. As Will mentioned, I'm going to talk today to you predominantly about there we go. Retirement living options. It's good to see the slides are working beautifully. Retirement living options for seniors. And I'll just give you a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. The first thing I want to really understand is why is there all this discussion about elders' needs? And I think the first thing we should look at is the demand. And there's some very interesting statistics in relation to that. And then I'm going to outline some options for retirement living. I'll deal with the obvious ones, like retirement villages, but also I want to address home care, and the main focus really is going to be on residential aged care. I'll discuss the funding of those various types of facilities, the different regulations. The regulation is complicated, and I'm a lawyer. They're tricky for me, I can tell you. So what chance do you all have? Because we've got state regulation on retirement village, we've got federal regulations on aged care. Now, we have to talk in this context about the Royal Commission, which we just had into our aged care. And I think it's really important, and I'll try and summarise the 2,800 pages of that Royal Commission report in a couple of slides. And then the main structural issue, problem issue in so many areas of our society, but particularly in relation to aged care, is workforce. And I'll outline some of the difficulties in that area. I'll also talk a little bit about the disruptive economy, the new world order, the Ubers of this world that are impacting particularly on home care. And finally, I want to leave you on a positive note, talking about some innovation that is, I think, well worth taking a good look at. There's some really terrific work being done in relation to options for seniors at the moment. So first, some stats. And as you'll probably tell from these slides, I like stats. Now, these stats are quite amazing, really, if you have a look at that 70% of all people who have ever lived to the age of 60 are alive today. Over the next 30 years, the number of people in Australia aged 65 to 84 will double, and the number over 85 will quadruple. And the life expectancy in Australia is increasing by 5 hours a day. Another amazing stat is that by 2020 there'll be more people over 65 than children under 14. So it's pretty clear we have an ageing society. Even more so if we look at the over 85s. This is the fastest growing group in our society, by far. And if you look at the last paragraph there, by 2061, which is a fair way off, there'll be 1.9 million Australians over 85. That's pretty extraordinary. In fact, there is an unauthorised statistic I read somewhere that suggests that the first person to live to 150 is alive today. Now, this is not from the Bureau of Statistics. I can't confirm that, but I have read that. It perhaps doesn't surprise me. So why do people move into aged care? There's different factors. There are what I call push factors and pull factors. The main push factors are health-related or no family support. There's a clear need. There's also pull factors. The cost could be very important. The pull factor might be the design. You might have a large house that you don't need anymore. You might like the nice smart unit at a retirement village. You might want to be close to family and friends or within a community. You may have lost a spouse. So does that mean, from those stats and those push and pull factors, does that mean it's a given? Well, it's really been very interesting over the last few years that it's not necessarily the case. The occupation levels in aged care facilities have declined from around 97% pre-pandemic, probably in about 2017, 2018, to something like 87 to 88% now. And I think Gerard mentioned some of the factors that are relevant to that. The fact that in an aged care facility during COVID, it was incredibly difficult to visit anyone there. I mean, so where's the quality of life to go into aged care if you can no longer see your family? I thought that was a very important point that Gerard made. And COVID itself has been a huge barrier to people wanting to move. People wanted to stay home. And also the other thing is, people prefer to get care into their home. There's been a huge growth in what's called home care. Now that's, and I see the mayor's nodding. The council here provides home care, but there's lots of different options now. Over 200,000 people in Australia access home care. It's about the same number that are in residential aged care. Okay, I think the other factor that I mentioned on the slide is that aged care has changed a lot in the last 10 years, almost really since the Julia Gillard's government, where she introduced the Living Longer, Living Better packages, which basically in those days aged care had low care and high care. Now it's predominantly high care, and obviously if people go into aged care with higher acuity, they're going to be there for a shorter period of time. So that's another reason that it just hasn't been, overrun at this point, like, for example, our hospitals have been. But I still think there's no doubt there's an inherent demand. The statistics will come through in the end. It might take a while. Once we get through COVID and we get a few more projects built to meet the need, I think you'll find a significant uptake in use of aged care facilities. So what are the options? Now the options are to stay at home, and that's what most people prefer to do. I'm sure that's a pretty obvious statement. They like to have their family look after them, or they want to age in place and access home care services. Or they might go into a retirement village. Now, most of you would know what a retirement village is. It's usually a facility with maybe 100 or maybe even 200, maybe more units congregated together where people provide. They still live independently, but they are provided with care services. Another fast-growing area is movable dwellings. These look like retirement villages, but they're not technically. And again, there's a third set of regulations that regulate them. One that's becoming quite popular is assisted living, like an apartment building that is effectively a retirement village, but it's a vertical retirement village. There's a very interesting one in Glen Iris, not that far from here, that's only just been opened by Bathcare. If you want to have a look at that sort of, it's a brand new type of retirement living option. I'll just spend a little bit of time looking at retirement living retirement village schemes, because I just think this is such a common type of retirement village option that living option that you really need to understand it. And again, it is complex because there are lots of different types of schemes. There are title-based schemes, which is very similar to your own home. You actually own the title to the unit. There are also, and they have the same sort of things that you would expect, a contract of sale to buy your property, and then there will be a management agreement in relation to the services you receive. Then there are several types of non-title based schemes, which are more common now than the title based schemes. The most common one is a lease scheme. And you might think, well, that's risky, but I'll explain to you in a minute why it's not so risky. And they all have, regardless of the structure of the scheme, they have different financial features. They have what are called deferred fees. Some of them have, others don't. And the rates of these deferred fees are different. I think one bit of advice I would confirm that we heard from Gerard is if you're going to get involved in anything in this space, you need to get excellent advice. You've got to understand what you're getting in for. But we do have the Retirement Villages Act, which is a piece of consumer protection legislation. And it has many features that protect your investment in your retirement village. The provider of a retirement village must lodge a notice on the title that affects and a charge on the title so that the amount you will get back eventually when you leave is secured. To give you the full information when you're going into the village, you will receive a fact sheet and a disclosure statement. And also, there must be resident participation in the management and operation of the village. So there are protections. Aged care funding is again quite complicated. But 80% of the funding in aged care is provided by the federal government. They've actually spend $23 billion a year on aged care. The Royal Commission, which I'll talk about in a minute, said they should be spending $30 billion. And it is quite an interesting, when we did a similar forum to this a month or so ago, it hadn't been raised as an election issue, aged care, but now it's front and centre, which it should be, because it's a huge percentage of the government's expenditure, and there are shortcomings. I might skip over the next slide. That's talking about the way you pay money into an aged care facility. There's acronyms everywhere in this industry. A RAD is a refundable accommodation deposit, or a DAP should just be called rent. So you can pay rent at aged care, or you can pay a capital sum. If you can't afford it, you should seek to get a subsidised place. And there's 40% of the places in aged care are in fact subsidised. Again, you get access to all these slides, but I think, we need to understand there's a substantial amount of regulation. But I think it's probably best if I talk about what the Australian government is focused on at the moment. Really, it is trying to give older Australians more choice. There's also a possibility, I think, a trend that will continue, that Australians that can afford to pay will have to pay, particularly when you're talking about numbers like 23 or $30 billion a year of government expenditure. Now, the Royal Commission, 148 recommendations made, 126 have been accepted so far. And there's the figures that I mentioned before. And as for the recommendations, it is 2,800 pages of recommendations. So in a couple of slides, the Royal Commission was very disappointed with what they saw when they looked into the sector. They insisted that there needs to be a universal right to quality care. There needs to be a restructuring of governance in aged care. There should be another Inspector General in aged care. Now, it is a heavily regulated society. I think one of the wishes I have as a lawyer working in this area is that the actual funding, the increased funding doesn't go just into bureaucracy, it goes into actually on the ground. I think that's absolutely critical. I'm not saying the Inspector General is not needed, but let's not create a massive bureaucracy that costs millions and millions and makes it harder for a provider to actually provide the care on the ground. There's a serious recommendations in relation to dementia care, which is a significant issue in aged care facilities. There's another recommendation, another recommendation in providing greater assistance to families. And also there's an acknowledgement there needs to be more home care packages because more and more people want to stay at home. Now, talking about the major structural issue that affects the sector at the moment, these statistics are quite extraordinary. That in 2012, there were 16.3 working aged people for every person over 80 years. In 2050, and these are ABS statistics, there'll be 5.5 working age people for every person over 80. Now that's quite extraordinary. I think the tax burden on those 5.5 people is going to be quite extraordinary unless things dramatically change. So it's pretty clear we do have a serious workforce issue in this sector. It's also, there is also a significant case that just started in the Fair Work Commission in Sydney yesterday, where the workers in the aged care sector are the lowest paid workers in Australia at anything. Now, you would know how difficult the job is to look after frail aged people. How can you get $10 an hour more pouring beers down the road here, just down the road here, compared to being a personal care attendant in an aged care facility? It's pretty obvious that the Fair Work Commission is going to give a significant pay increase, and that will be something that will help get workers back into this sector, and particularly nurses. Nurses in aged care get paid less than nurses in hospitals, and they get paid less than nurses that are manning a vaccination centre, where there's really no ongoing pressure and difficulty in the tasks they carry out. And I'm talking about $20 an hour difference. It's not like a small amount of difference. So if you're a nurse, why wouldn't you sit with someone and make sure that give them an injection and sit there, and then the next person comes in, and then the next one comes in, and then you go home, compared to the responsibilities you have looking after frail-aged Australians. I mentioned briefly that there's been an Uberisation of parts of this sector, particularly home care. There are other examples, of course, in our society. I don't think a residential aged care facility is likely to become Ubered, if you like, but home care certainly will, and it's already happening. Now, just finishing on a positive note, this is an aged care facility in Rotterdam, run by an organisation called Humanitas. And this doesn't look like an aged care facility. This just looks like a community hub, a bar or a cafe, and that's what aged care should look like. It's not a compound as such. And I'm the Deputy Chair of Mercy Health, and we've, after seeing that in Holland about 8 years ago, Mercy Health have two facilities, one in Ballarat and one in Montrose, that have a small home model. And the small home model is very similar to this. There's a photo you can see of those two facilities. And instead of having one home with 96 beds, if I get my arithmetic right, there are 12 homes of 8 beds and 8 kitchens, 8 laundries. So the residents can, to the extent they can work, they can look after themselves. And I'm pleased to say that there's a facility, Mercy Health is building a facility like this in Mentone in the next year or so. And these are substantial. It costs, it's a significant investment for a non-for-profit. It costs about $30 or $35 million to build such a facility. But I think this is the future. So if I could just wrap it up. I think there's a sector-wide workforce crisis. That's self-evident. It's not just in this sector, as I've said before. Every cafe you go past says help wanted. It's just the way it is. I heard the other day at one of the events at the MCG, they had a massive crowd at some event, and there were 800 less staff than they normally have at the MCG for that event. So it's not just this sector, but this sector needs to have a workforce plan. The government funding definitely needs to increase. If the Fair Work Commission gives everyone a pay rise, there's only one way that can be paid for the sector to remain sustainable, and that's if the government pays it. At the moment, the Labor Party has said they will pay it, and the current government, they haven't been committed either way, but really they won't have a choice. I see retirement villages having more care brought into them over time. That's something I think is likely to happen. So people who want to be independent for as long as possible could get home care into their retirement village. It makes a lot of economic sense. If you've got 200 elderly people in the one facility, why wouldn't you provide home care? It'd be so much easier to provide home care to that group than travelling all around. Innovation is the key. We must get better. And there will be, to keep lawyers busy forever, there'll be ongoing regulatory work, reforms, I'm sure of that. So thanks very much. I look forward to the questions later.
Thanks, John. Very interesting, some of those statistics, very, very kind of eye-opening. Next speaker that we have is Meg Darling. She's from the ANZ Bank. She's the Customer Vulnerability and Accessibility Lead at ANZ. And she's going to talk to you today about, I believe, about kind of how the financial sector goes about trying their best to protect older people. There's lots of different ways in which they're involved. It's really great that she's here to talk to us about that and how I think what Gerard was talking about in terms of how there's lots of options for people to go to. It's just about making sure that people are aware of them, and the financial and banking is one of those. Okay. Well, welcome, Meg.
Good morning, everyone. Just see if the little slides work. Yep. Perfect. So my name's Meg Darling. Thank you, Will, for the introduction. I'd like to also start by acknowledging the traditional elders of the land on which we're meeting today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Really lovely to have the invitation from PCLC to come and speak with you today. In my role at ANZ Bank, I lead our strategic approach to looking after customer vulnerability and also accessibility. So in that role, we work right across the bank around policies, processes and programs to support our frontline staff to identify customers that might be at risk of vulnerability, know how to provide support, and in particular how to internally refer those customers to specialist teams within the bank, and in many cases refer them externally for specialist support. We in particular focus on family and domestic violence. We also do work with support customers in more remote Indigenous communities. We have programs to support older customers, people who might face language barriers, literacy barriers, in particular financial literacy barriers, and also customers with disability. So it's a really broad-ranging program that we work around. So today the focus is on financial elder abuse. We've been hearing about elder abuse, and financial elder abuse is obviously a really important aspect of that, and that's the bit that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. It is kind of a serious topic, a very grave topic, but I hope that I can leave you with some practical tips from the bank's perspective. You know, what do we see in this area of financial elder abuse, and what things do we think would help in particular customers, but people generally in the community? Sometimes you might be in a caring role. What sorts of things can you do to help those around you to protect against risks of elder abuse? So just starting off, you've heard a little bit of a, you know, an overview from Gerard around elder abuse generally and the types of forms that it can take. I think financial elder abuse is pretty obvious. It's really about when someone else is trying to control your money. But it may be tied with other forms of abuse. It could be linked with neglect. It could be linked with, you know, preventing someone from accessing grandchildren. You know, we've seen cases where older customers have been threatened that they won't get access to grandchildren, for example, if they don't sign up to be a guarantor or a co-borrower on a loan. So these things can all be quite interwoven. It can happen to anyone, financial abuse, but we do know that older people can be at increased risk. We heard about the risks of isolation that can happen to some people in the community as they get older, and of course COVID has had a massive impact on the risk of isolation. People that have a physical or a mental disability are also at increased risk, and we also know that people who have lower financial literacy, more limited understanding of finance are at increased risk, simply because you may then be more likely to rely on someone else to help you out. And of course, just being generally reliant on other people for care, because banking is, you know, always going to be a part of your daily needs. So we know that needing support as we get older is common, but sadly it can also open the door to abuse. And the sorts of things that we see, a lot of people will take steps to try and prepare for that time of life when they might need some help, some support. And so we will see formalised support mechanisms such as a power of attorney or a third-party authority. These are quite common things that we see in banks, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between these. There's a lot of informal support, though, that happens in the community as well. And interestingly, the national prevalence study into elder abuse that Gerard mentioned, which was really a landmark study late last year, which, you know, really for the first time gave us a much deeper insight into how widespread elder abuse is, but also the different forms and how it presents. A really interesting statistic that came out of that study for banks was that of the respondents to that study, 28% said that they had given another person access to their banking. And this is done in an informal way. So whereas that contrasts with a power of attorney, or what we call a third-party authority at the bank, informal support's where someone just gives access, their PIN, their password, their card, that is more problematic for a bank. Because we're not able to detect as easily if it's a different person transacting on that account. We're not able to see where there's something that is more suspicious. So that's one to be very mindful of. While we know that's a common phenomenon, we would actually prefer, from a bank perspective, that people have formal support arrangements in place. I should use my slides here that I've prepared. Right. So I have got here a bit of an overview of how you might think about protecting yourself against the risk of financial abuse. One of the most important things is thinking about who will be your support team. Who might you appoint to be your attorney? Who might you appoint to be a third-party authority on your account? You obviously want to find someone who has the right skills, but it's really important that you don't necessarily default to a member of your family. They may not be the best person for that role. And of course the national prevalence study into elder abuse, again, as Gerard mentioned, it really highlighted that in particular with financial abuse, it's often very trusted people that are the ones that are perpetrating abuse. So it might not be the family member that is the right person to appoint as your power of attorney. So think about that. Who's the right person to be in your support team? I mentioned the different types of instruments that we see to give someone else some decision-making support for you. A general, and you know, I think the elder law clinic that Will and the team at PCLC run will be able to give you very detailed advice on these sorts of instruments. But just as a very quick overview, we have a general power of attorney, which is where you will give someone the power to look after your financial and legal matters. It might include buying and selling real estate or shares. It could include opening bank accounts, spending money on your behalf. These sorts of general powers of attorney can be really useful for a specific period of time, particularly when someone might have needed to travel. But a particular feature of a general power of attorney is that they're only effective when you have capacity, when you still retain decision-making capacity. So general power of attorney will come to an end if you lose capacity. An enduring power of attorney, on the other hand, is more an instrument that you can use for the future. So if you do lose capacity, whether that's through a gradual, slow decline, or whether it's through an accident or through illness, an enduring power of attorney will continue to operate, and the person that you have appointed will be able to continue to support you. You can tailor these sorts of documents to your needs. It's really, really important that you always get advice when you put these sorts of instruments in place. And then the other sort of document that we see very commonly, but I think maybe the community is not always aware that there is a sort of a lesser form of instrument, if you like, that can give someone some support, help provide you with some support over your banking, and that we call that a third-party authority at the bank. And that is really just about your banking. It's not about other aspects of your life. It might be about specific accounts only, 1 or 2 savings accounts, transactions accounts. It will not be about a loan account, and it won't be for a credit account. But if you would like someone to help you with your everyday banking, a third-party authority can be a really practical way of setting that up. It can also be set up with restraints on it, with controls on it, limits on it. So again, it can be done in a way that sort of is tailored to your circumstances. So other things to do. Obviously what we're talking about here is when things go wrong, if you like. So remembering that while we can set up these sorts of authorities, they can become tools of abuse. Particularly if you are sharing the management of your accounts with someone else, there's definitely some things that you can do to protect yourself in that period. So really monitoring your banking is a critical one, and we all should be doing that anyway, looking out for transactions that don't look right. Could actually be by someone who is managing your accounts for you. If you do make changes or you revoke or cancel a power of attorney, it's really important to let your bank know if you've got that document lodged with your bank. There's been a lot of work in the last couple of years, advocacy to try and get nationally consistent laws around powers of attorney. We have different laws in every state. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. So what that means is there isn't a national register, for example. So there's no way for a bank to check if your power of attorney is still current. We rely on our customers to come and tell us when there's been a change or when they've been revoked. The banking sector has done a lot of advocacy in relation to this, because we know that having a national register would be a really, really significant step to limiting the risks of financial abuse, because we would know that instruments that are put in front of us are the most current. We also train our frontline staff to pick up red flags of financial abuse, so statements, behaviours, things that look suspicious to us. So if they do have concerns, we have a customer advocate team within the bank, and they can get in touch with that team to get a bit of advice. What do we do when that happens? We will review a person's banking, we'll look at transactions and try and understand if there's something going on there that doesn't look right for that customer. If we have very significant concerns, we may actually put a pause on the banking. We may suspend any digital banking or over-the-counter banking. We will do that in conjunction with the customer to the extent that we're able to get in contact. Sometimes we can't get in contact with a customer. So we heard also about scenarios where you may have an abusive family member who is isolating that person, and it's actually quite difficult for the bank to get in touch. But in all the circumstances, we will review these scenarios and we will take action. In some instances, we will engage with the police, and sometimes we need to even reach out with some of the state-based adult safeguarding agencies. So, for example, we have had cases where we can see quite clearly that an attorney, a person who holds a power of attorney over another person's account, is very much misusing that account, and we will engage with like a public advocate or a state trustee to look at how that person may need to be removed as an attorney. So we talked about the fact that sadly people that perpetrate financial abuse are often the people that our customers trust and depend on the most. And in fact, children, according to the prevalence study, children were the biggest group for this. 33% of all perpetrators of financial elder abuse were children, followed by friends, but also service providers. Gerard also mentioned the reluctance to seek help. And again, that's something we see at the bank. So we may actually be the party that first raises this with a customer. We may see something that looks suspicious, and we get in touch and we raise this. And particularly where there's a relationship of trust, it can be highly sensitive. And we have cases where, for example, where it's an adult child who is managing the customer's accounts where there is great reluctance even to take action. They're very worried about that child getting into trouble, and so we are very restricted in what we can do in those situations without the consent of that customer. So that is a really that is a big challenge that banks see. The other issue that I am going to talk about a little bit is another dimension of financial abuse, which I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with, and that is really the growing prevalence of scams, financial scams in the community, and fraud. And I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time giving you some tips on what to look out for to protect yourself in this regard. So firstly, well, what's the difference between a scam and a fraud? A scam involves a relationship of trust to some degree. If someone actually gains your confidence in order to steal your money or your information, scammers often use quite sophisticated lies to trick you. A fraudster, on the other hand, an account fraudster is really when somebody accesses your funds without your knowledge or your authority. You might not actually be aware of a fraud that's happened until you notice it on your bank statement, or you even receive a call from your bank. Some of you may have had a call from your bank or a message alerting you to something suspicious. So scams in particular are a really exploding area of crime, and it's something I would encourage everyone to seek out information and become informed about this, because we are seeing a really, really significant increase in this at banks. Just last year, more than 280,000 Australians made reports to the ACCC's Scam Watch organisation. Now, these are the people that have made reports. There are lots of types of scams where we know they go unreported, particularly scams that might involve shame or embarrassment for a person, like a romance scam or an investment scam, where someone is quite embarrassed that they've fallen victim to that scam. So of those reported scams, there were more than $300 million lost by Australians. But of course, they don't just cost money. You know, scams cause huge emotional and psychological harm to people and their families. We know that scams target people of all ages and backgrounds, so the statistics are really clear. They actually don't discriminate in lots of ways. We can all fall victim to scams. But there are some types of scams that are particularly targeting older Australians. And some of this is based on, I think, beliefs of scammers. There is a perception that older Australians may have more money available. Scammers do things like scour dating sites and social media for older people who might have recently divorced or lost a long-term partner. So there's really quite predatory sort of behaviour that is underlying some of this. Older Australians may also, in some cases, be seen as less internet savvy or familiar with new technology. And so I think the sorts of programs you're seeing from the council, for example, around digital education are really, really important in addressing some of that. And I'm going to talk at the end about some of the resources that you can look to increase your own digital literacy and digital education. So what types of scams do we see? We see lots in the IT support area. So this is really a remote access type scam where someone rings you and says, I'm from Telstra, I just need to log in to your system there and provide you with some sort of support. These are remarkably very successful. So IT support, I mentioned romance and dating scams. Investment scams, we see a lot of these at the bank. It could be someone who's claiming to be giving advice, or they have something that they want you to invest in. They're basically persuading you to hand over money for something that's probably too good to be true, but nonetheless, these are also very successful. In fact, investment scams are the biggest category of scam losses. Other types relating to job opportunities, travel scams, fake charities, buying and selling products. And then in terms of fraud, some of these terms that have sort of come into our lingo these days are phishing, where people will try to get you to hand over your username or password so that they can then access your banking. Skimming, this is where a device is installed on an EFTPOS machine or an ATM to try and retrieve data from your card. Even things like a missed call fraud, where someone will call you, then hang up promptly, which might prompt some people to call back to find out who that was. And then, then you might have inadvertently found yourself on a number where there's very high call charges. So they're very creative. There's lots of bad people out there who are trying to part you from your money. So I think it's a really good area to inform yourself around. So importantly, what can you do? How can you protect yourself against scams and fraud? It seems really obvious, but it's still something that I think we don't always do. If we get a suspicious phone call, it's really important you just hang up. Just hang up, don't be polite, just hang up. If it really is quite legitimate, that person will try to call you back, or they'll make another attempt to contact you. But if you've got any alarm bells ringing, really hang up. Emails that come to you, be really alert to things that don't look quite right. Never click on links unless you're really, really confident you know where it's come from. It goes without saying not to share your password, your personal information, etc. This is a tricky one because I know I mentioned earlier that the national prevalence study around elder abuse tells us that actually a large number of people in the community are sharing these things. So this is really tricky. We know this is a behaviour that is very common, but it actually really does expose you to risk. Because once you've disclosed your password or your PIN to another person, then you've kind of lost control of it. It can be shared further. Obviously, what we're talking here is about someone who's targeting you, but it's really just that behaviour of being really, really careful and not sharing that information. Having up-to-date software on your computer, not sending money to people that you don't know. Again, these things all sound sort of obvious, but I think when you're in the situation of reading a very compelling email or you've had a very compelling phone call, it can be quite difficult to sort of detach yourself from that and stand back and realise that, that's actually maybe someone who's trying to take advantage of me. With fraud, there are tips that you can do to protect yourself, like always using secure websites, looking out for the little padlock symbol. It's actually much more secure to tap your card if you can, if you're comfortable doing that, rather than inserting it. We mentioned keeping your information secure. And I also mentioned earlier, it's really, it's a really good practice, a really good habit to get into, to be checking your bank accounts regularly. Just looking out for things that are not quite right. The bank is doing this as well. The bank has very extensive suspicious transaction monitoring that's continuously running in the background. And some of you may have had that phone call saying, we noticed that something happened on your account. Was that you? So we are trying to look out for that as well, but you're also very well placed to do that. And I've got a big sort of highlight there at the bottom. Please reach out to your bank if you have been a victim of a scam or a fraud. There's always steps that can be taken. Often money can be recovered, not always, but often it can. And the banks do a lot of work collectively, particularly when scams impact right across the community. The banks will work together to try and have sort of shared responses to that. So I'm going to leave you with just some resources there and where to get further help. On the left is an image of a really terrific publication that was put together by the Australian Banking Association, which is the industry body for banks, called Safe and Savvy. It's a guide to help prevent and protect yourself from abuse and scams. And I've got some copies of that publication with me today, so please come up and let me know if you'd like a copy. It's also available online on the Australian Banking Association website. I would encourage you to have a look at the eSafety Commission's Be Connected website. The Federal eSafety Commission does a lot of public education around digital literacy, knowing that this is the future, and the quicker that we can become confident and comfortable with technology, the better. And there are a lot of resources and even courses. You can do online free courses within that website to help familiarise yourself with things that you might not have done before. There's even a kind of a pretend banking course if you've never done online banking before. There is a national helpline if you yourself are worried about elder abuse, elder financial abuse in all the forms it might take, or you are concerned about someone that you know. You can call the national 1300 Elder Help line, and they will give you further guidance. I've got a link there to the ACCC Scam Watch website, is where you can get information and report a scam. And then finally, there's a national body that specifically focuses on supporting people who may have been the victim of having an ID fraud, and someone has taken over their identity, and there are various steps that have to be taken to restore that person. So that's it from me. And I think we're going to have a few questions later, but yeah, please come up to me and I'm happy to hand out that resource if it helps. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks Meg for that. That was very enlightening. So, bit of a break for morning tea. I believe we've got just regular vegetarian, vegan, gluten-free options that are available for everybody over there. They all look delicious, so grab yourself a little carton there and have something to eat. We'll come back in about 10-15 minutes. I'll do a quick little game with you, especially for the people here. You miss out if you're at home, about wills and estates, and then we'll do our panel discussion and we'll answer some questions from you. Okay, so go have something to eat, refresh yourself. We might get everybody to start slowly making their way back to their seats, and we can continue with the forum. Yeah, I'm happy to. Okay, so we'll couple of stragglers at the back there. So I hope everybody enjoyed their morning tea. Was it nice? That's good. That's good. I'm glad. So my name's William Betts. I'm a solicitor at Peninsula Community Legal Centre, and my day job is I'm a duty lawyer at the Frankston Magistrates Court in family violence, and now part of my job is assisting elderly people, and that kind of came about from us seeing at the court a number of elderly people who are victims of family violence, elder abuse, and we saw that it was a kind of a need on the peninsula that wasn't being met. And so both at Frankston and Moorabbin we saw this and we thought, well, we're going to have to kind of address this and move into this area. And one of the things that we've kind of noticed is one of the times and areas that kind of interlink with the elder abuse we're seeing is wills and estate planning. Often not only fights over wills, but the drafting of wills and those kind of issues around estates can really lead people to conflict and can lead people into situations where they're being pressured to make wills, change wills, that kind of thing. So, in order to, I'm going to assume that everybody knows what a will is, but I'll just briefly say that it's essentially a way that, a legal document that dictates how your estate, your assets are distributed upon your passing. And planning for that is a really important way to, in some ways, protect yourself from elder abuse. Being clear about what's in your will and how it works and how it's going to work is really important. So what I like to do in forums like this is play a little game, a Will's Will game. And essentially, everybody here is going to have to participate. Obviously, you can participate at home, but I'm not going to be able to see whether you've got your hand raised or not. So for the people here, just a couple of quick questions. And the purpose of these questions, really, and the purpose of this game is for each of you to consider about whether I need to get further advice about my will or whether I need to draft a new will in light of my answer to some of these questions. So I guess the first question is, who here has a will? Hands up. Good. You've done well. That's the first hurdle is overcome. So, second question. Who drafted their will in the last 5 years? Very good, very good. Last 10 years? Last 20 years? There we go. So that answer to those questions is a really good sign. If you're in that kind of later bracket, especially the 20-year plus bracket, it might be time to pull the will out, have a read of it, make sure it still reflects your wishes in relation to how you wish to distribute your assets. Okay. Another question. Who knows where their original copy of their will is? For those who didn't put up their hands and are perhaps not sure about where their original will is, probably a very good idea to try and figure out where it is, because one of the things that can often happen, especially with the drafting of a will, and one of the processes that you go about when you draft a will, is that the original copy is often kept in a secure place by the solicitor who assisted you in drafting it. But firms do not last forever. They're not immortal things. They often close, they often change hands, partnerships change, lawyers retire. And so you want to make sure that you're fully aware of where your original will is so you can advise the trustees and the people that are involved in the beneficiaries as to where it is upon your passing. Now, if you have no idea and you're unable to track it down, that's probably a sign that you need to draft a new will. Okay. Another quick question. Who here knows what the most valuable asset in their will is? So for most people, that's a pretty easy question to answer. Most people, it's their home, if they own a home. But obviously, it's worth considering, well, what other assets, valuable assets do I have that I want to actually make sure are distributed how I wish them to be? One of the big questions that come up a lot in these kind of forums and what people need advice about is what's going to happen to their superannuation. A lot of people have a lot of value in their super that they may not have, it may still be there, and it may even be still accruing value, especially if they're self-funded retiree. What's going to happen to that superannuation? Okay, it's a very complex question. It has a lot of different answers, and a lot of it depends on the kind of fund that you're involved in and all sorts of things. So that's the kind of thing that if you're like, wait a second, what does my will say about my super? That's the kind of thing that you want to get some advice either from a solicitor about, or by a financial planner, or contacting your super fund, whoever that may be, and discussing with them, what's going to happen to my super? How does that fit into my estate? Another question. Who has spoken to their beneficiaries about what they're getting in their will? Now, one of the things I like to advise people about when they're drafting their wills or thinking about their estates is thinking about the will document not just about how you're going to distribute your assets, but also how is that going to be received by the beneficiaries? Have you had that discussion about my son Billy is going to get X and my daughter Joan is going to get Y? Billy and Joan know what they're going to get. Are they happy with what they're going to get? Is there a dispute that could happen between Billy and Joan about X and Y? Because one of the things that we see a lot of is when someone passes, There's a lot of emotions that come out. There's a lot of things that people, especially siblings, children, family members, perhaps unresolved emotions about the person that's passed, and that can lead to significant amount of conflict. Often it's not necessarily just about the assets, but sometimes it can be. Often the dispute about the will becomes a proxy for a lot of those other issues. So you should consider your will a means by which you can try and cut off a lot of those disputes. And sometimes the best way to do that is to have open communication with your beneficiaries about what they're likely to get and in what form they're going to get and who's going to get what. It can be a very difficult conversation to have and can be uncomfortable, but if you can do it, I would recommend that you do it, because you can start to air some of these issues and be aware of them, potentially even change your will if you think it's actually something that's appropriate for you after having that conversation. You may not know that Billy has always thought or wanted a particular piece of furniture and that Joan doesn't really care about it, but in your will you give it to Joan. Okay? Might cause a conflict. So it's easier to have that conversation, try and resolve those before they even erupt. The last thing I'd say is, last question, can anybody answer this? Does your will create a trust? Or any kind of trust instrument? Now, if your estate is significantly large or complicated in terms of how it's owned, how it's structured, how much of it is actually owned, then a trust is an instrument that you can use that can be created through the will that can have significant benefits in relation to your tax or the way that the assets are distributed throughout by the will. Okay? If you either are considering a trust or have a trust but you're not sure how it works, please contact us, contact a lawyer, get some legal advice about trusts. Okay? They are, again, it's a very complex area of law, equity, something that you should get advice about. Okay? Now, another quick question. I know I said that was my last question, but I've got another one I just remembered. Put your hand up if one of the beneficiaries in your will has recently separated or divorced. Or if they've had a significant change in their circumstances. One of the things that we often forget to consider is the circumstances of our beneficiaries when thinking about whether we need to get further advice about our will. Modern wills these days do have the capacity to deal with things such as blended families, what happens when someone divorces, stepchildren, that kind of thing. But you want to be aware of your beneficiary's circumstances when making a will. Does your will give something to a now ex-partner who, when you drafted the will, your child was married, but now they're no longer married? Has someone had an accident in which they may have lost capacity? And do you want to now make a trust in order to have the assets distributed to them in a way that is not going to cause them any difficulties? Okay? So not only do you want to think about your circumstances, both in terms of your estate, but also think about the circumstances of your beneficiaries. What are their circumstances? Has they changed? And that relates again to what I said before about having that conversation with your beneficiaries if you can. So, let me just check the time. So, one thing I will say, we're going to open up for discussions and I'll start taking some questions. I will say from the start, if you've got a question about your will or your estate that relates to you and is not a particularly general question, I would ask you to contact PCLC, ask to get some formal advice. because as we've said before, this is not legal advice, but if you do need legal advice, for instance, if you answered some of those questions and it made you think, actually, wow, I do need to look at my will again, please contact us. Probably today's not the best forum to ask those kind of questions about, well, my son's divorced and now I want to, what does that mean for my will? So, as I said, we might open it up to the panel, and perhaps we can start with a show of hands, and I don't know if we've got a microphone to pass around. If anybody's got any questions for the panel. Sure.
And it's in relation to the retirement villages issue. And it's a question in relation to people who buy into the lease arrangements or retirement villages and the way that there seems to be diminishing sort of, they buy into something that they don't realise that there is a diminishing return on their investment over a period of time, and how sometimes that can be a surprise to the family at the end of the process. And I don't think you covered that sort of significantly in your presentation. If you could sort of speak to that a little bit more, because sometimes family members can be a bit shocked at the end of that process.
Yeah, there are many different financial arrangements at retirement villages, but a very common one is the one you're alluding to, where when people leave the village, they pay what's called a deferred management fee. And in general terms, it can be as much as, say, 30% of the value of the, it's usually calculated as they go. If you're there, it's 3% a year, say, for a maximum of 10 years, just to give an example. So if you're there for more than 10 years, when you leave the village, there is a fee. Now, the retirement village operators will tell you that the reason that fee exists at the back end is because they paid less when they went in. They didn't pay the full market price when they went in. I'm not saying that's correct, but that's the story. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, though, in that sort of scheme is that the capital gain, if the unit has gone up from 500,000 to 800,000 over the period of occupancy, the gain is with the resident, generally speaking. There are some schemes where the gain is not with the resident, but it is and I mentioned the fact sheet and the disclosure statement that have to be given to people entering into a retirement village. That must clearly explain all fees, including this deferred fee. There's a bit of a trend to simplify that. There was a major retirement village operator from New Zealand that's come into Australia and has done extremely well by limiting that fee to around 20%, calculating it at 4% for 5 years to about 20%. But there is, you just need to check who gets the capital gain in that sort of scenario. So it is something that I would recommend that anyone here who's going into a village, that they let their family know what those arrangements are. So to take up Will's point, so there's no surprise at the back end. But it is a very common scenario that you've painted there.
If I could add to that as well, John, part of my role as Commissioner, the government made a commitment to review the Retirement Villages Act, and I'm still hoping that proceeds in this term of government. And so if people are interested, there are a number of discussion papers on the Department of Consumer Affairs website about that. One of the key issues that consumers have raised, not surprisingly, is the disclosure of what contracts mean. And one of the areas of reform that's being tested, there's no guarantee it'll go ahead, but one of the things consumer groups have asked for, and I've certainly strongly supported this, that there should be an annual statement to the consumer about what's happening in relation to that deferred management fee, so that not only is it then something that happens in 10 or 12 years' time if they move out of the retirement village, but it comes up annually as a prompt and a reminder to have the very conversations that John's talking about. So I think it's very important that the reform that's being proposed does go through our Victorian Parliament, because it's all through the context of giving stronger consumer protections and rights to the people living in the village. So that's reform that I'd bring to your attention that is on the radar for the current government.
Yeah, and there has been a commitment from the government that they were going to pass this legislation before the election in November. So, and I also emphasise that the Retirement Villages Act is consumer protection legislation, so the sort of improvement that Gerard is mentioning would seem to be right within the sweet spot of the Act.
Got some questions, one here and then one here.
Thank you. Look, mine is to Meg. One of the concerns I have for a lot of older people is that with the increasing computerisation, their inability to go with their passbook or whatever to the bank, a lot of old people are really frightened by the technology. So just a comment for you on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a real challenge, and there's a lot more work that can be done to build confidence and digital literacy with all sorts of groups, certainly older Australians, but also other groups in Australia. We know there's a very significant what we call digital inclusion gap across Australia, so other cohorts in the community where there's language barriers, etc. But with older Australians, I think you are seeing initiatives like the work of the eSafety Commission, and banks have worked with the eSafety Commission to contribute to the public and free courses that they provide. But I think we know at ANZ that we have to do a lot of work to support people in this transition. Banks are not unique. I always make the comment, we're not unique. This is a challenge that cuts across all sectors. Government services are moving to digital delivery. There are people that may have traditionally relied on walking into a Centrelink office to do that. They are diminishing as well, shrinking. So it's a very real challenge. Obviously, COVID, again, the pandemic has played a huge role in that because we actually saw a significant acceleration to digital in all aspects of our life. We had to do things online, we had to communicate with others, we had to socialise, we had to work, we had to consume, shop, etc. So actually a lot of people have moved faster to digital and technology than we probably ever anticipated. And I think that's been a really interesting phenomenon, and we won't be going backwards. But what you're saying is absolutely right. There are people in the community, including older Australians, who will need more support. I'm very mindful, obviously, in the work that I do that, as we move to digital, and for people who are not comfortable yet with digital, that may increase their level of reliance on others, and hence that may increase their risk of abuse. So it opens the door to abuse. So there are absolutely links there. And I think, and you mentioned some people might like to still use a passbook. Passbook holders were a big particular challenge during COVID because if you hold a passbook account with a bank, it's your only way of getting cash. You have to walk inside a branch and withdraw over the counter. And obviously, particularly in the first year of the pandemic, before we had vaccines, older groups were really being recommended to very much limit their time in the community, even before we had lockdowns. So you had this tension of that's the only way of getting money. There was no other way of, no ATM card, no nothing. So the banks actually worked together at that point to get an approval from the ACCC to proactively send cards out to those tens of thousands of customers across Australia who held passbook accounts. So it was, it sort of looks like we're colluding, we're getting together and doing something collectively. So we actually needed a regulatory approval to be able to do that collectively. There wasn't actually a significant uptake. So while those cards were sent out with the blessing of the regulator to assist those customers to transact or bank digitally if they wanted to, and that's even just using a card at an ATM or taking it to a supermarket where you can also get cash, there still was not significant uptake. So we are very mindful of those groups in the community, and yeah, it's very much it's a challenge that we still face into.
If I could also add to that, as Commissioner, this is one of the areas that I comment on and advise on to the government on very commonly, from a state government perspective. And there's two things that I think are different ends of the continuum. One is lots of older people get very annoyed that just because they're older they can't connect digitally. And so over the last couple of years in particular, many councils and libraries and U3As and men's sheds and neighbourhood houses have run a number of courses to provide an opportunity for older people to learn. And I think that's been a really good thing. I think one of the challenges with digital is not feeling that you're silly. And so being in an environment it's a safe environment that you can learn in the right way has been a really positive thing for lots of older people. And so I'd encourage that to continue. I think one of the, as I said earlier, one of the, seeing people that can suddenly open a new world doing things that they hadn't thought that they could actually do has been a really positive thing. But on the other hand, a lot of my own advocacy is to continually remind government and businesses that we also need alternatives. There's always going to be a group of people, and older people are amongst that, for whom the digital world is always going to be one step too far. And so we need to always remember what are the alternatives that might exist to the digital world.
I think we had one question over here.
Yep, hi. My name is Kelly and I'm from Women's Health in the South East, and my question was in regards to whether there's, what we haven't heard today is whether gender lens has been applied to the elder law, elder abuse and financial abuse today, and what is being done in that area. As I look around the room today, the large representation here is female, and I'm sure there's some I'm assuming there's some very important statistics out there, and particular as we know that the group of 55 plus, over 55 plus women, the statistics for homelessness is growing as well, and that I'm sort of guessing might be tied in terms of, financial abuse, like, low superannuation and all that. So I don't know, the question is open to anyone on the chairs. Yep.
I mean, I can answer some of that question in relation to there is a pretty wide array of statistics in relation to the connection between, because you've got to kind of pull things apart. There is elder abuse, which actually would fall into what more traditionally people would think of as family violence, that is interspousal and intimate partner violence. I think what the panel's been talking about a lot today is the more broader elder abuse issue, which falls kind of outside of what we would consider the traditional family violence, even though it kind of, again, we're talking about subsets of subsets. In terms of my understanding of the distribution between male and female, it does slightly skew towards female, but perhaps not as much as you might expect. And in fact, from my looking at the statistics, it looks like that skewing is in relation to the overwhelming prevalence in relation to spousal violence, being the survivors of family violence in relation to interpersonal violence, kind of creating that gap. But in terms of, and thanks for that question, but I think And does anybody else have something they might
Yeah, so
like
the data is reasonably clear. If you look at it through the family violence lens, it's dominated by gender-based violence of a male against a female. That's the dominant form. Now, there are other forms as well. So the LGBTIQ community might be, in fact, reverse of that. Yep. So it's not totally a gender-based, but it's the dominant form. From an elder abuse perspective, it's a very, very different platform. It's much more spread across. So the majority of people who are the victims are still female, but there's a much higher proportion of males compared to family violence more broadly. In the Victorian context, the state government has, as a result of our Royal Commission here in Victoria, accepted elder abuse as a form of family violence. So people that are experiencing elder abuse can reach out to the family violence sector for support. The government provides some funding to organisations like Seniors Rights Victoria to provide very frontline assistance. If you look at the perpetrators of abuse, again, it's more closely aligned between males and females. So it's not as gender-based, so it is still more likely to be a male perpetrator of abuse, but there are far more, say adult daughters also feature high. The adult son is probably the highest, but then the adult daughter wouldn't be far behind that. So it's typically, if you look at the top three, it would be the adult son, the adult daughter, and then the partner would be typically the order that it would appear. Whereas in family violence that was gender-based, it would be dominated by the male partner. So it looks as a profile quite different.
And that actually raises an issue that one of the things that we saw from the court was that we very much were often trying to put a round peg into a square hole when dealing with people that came to the court experiencing elder abuse, because the processes and systems are designed very much around intimate partner violence. It can be effective, but there were some additional options that we had to develop in order to assist people who are experiencing elder abuse, because sometimes the law is a very blunt instrument in relation to dealing with these things.
Can I just add something as well? I mean, I think Will, just giving a bit of a plug to the PCLC's Elder Law Clinic, where I volunteer and Will tends as well, that I think every client I've seen is female so far. So there's just a bit of I don't know if that's objective, but a subjective comment.
And it might be as well that, and I don't know what the statistics are on this, and Gerard, you might know, is whether it's more about elderly gentlemen not seeking assistance, much more resistant to seek that assistance. And I've experienced that quite a lot, because the stuff we see that comes into the court, police have generally had to become involved, and so the elderly person is not necessarily the one that's instigated the engagement. It might be a neighbour, family, other family members, friends, that kind of thing. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I live in a retirement village, and there's a lot of extreme abuse there and extreme negligence. Some of the negligence I tried to get fixed, and I was labelled and I was bullied and threatened. And so I thought if I went above the abusive manager to the area manager and the state manager, I might get some support. Instead, I received extreme bullying and abuse, and very bad verbal, emotional abuse on a phone call. So I had no copy, but I did write some notes. So I thought, well, if I go to the directors, they will see that this is very bad, and they'll know that our village is on the bottom of the many that this company has, and they might take action. What I received, and this is why I'm asking questions, what I received was a lot of gaslighting. They told me that everything had been repaired in the village. They contradicted everything that I said. The pond is often putrid. They said that it was healthy. It was very bad to the point where they demanded my son's details saying that he had power of attorney over me, and my son doesn't. And I'm giving you my example, but I've helped a lot of people in the village, especially older people, older women. Some of them didn't finish primary school and don't have the skills, where I'd been a teacher and for a lot of years a company director of a smaller company. So I was capable of speaking up, so people started to come to me. And then the word that I was given today is blocking. I knew that they were blocking me, but now I've got the word for what they've done. They're blocking me with gaslighting, with lies, with defamation, with threats. They've threatened to move me. I have a unit that's looking out on the pond. They've threatened to move me to another unit, and mine has the best view. So if they move me to another unit, I might not be able to see the pond and the birds. And it's an extreme problem in the village. One lady in her late 80s, now 90, had uneven concrete at her back door, and they said it was safe. And she'd tripped there, I'd tripped there, other visitors had tripped there, and it was actually very dangerous. And she'd had a bad fall. I'd hurt myself in my fall because I'd landed on something. When the problems are that extreme and they use bullying, intimidation, threats, lies, defamation, and it's throughout the village, it's not just me. A friend died recently who was a very fit, active person. She said, "Beth, I've lost my will to live. I do not have any more will to live." And boom, she went and died. There was no other way. She just lost her will. And I work currently as a counsellor. I gave her counselling. There are some very bad bullies in the village, and one lives where you walk out. And so the woman who died recently was afraid to walk out. I said, "I found you a good psychologist." She wouldn't go because it meant going out of the village. And there are other people who are not leaving their units, not going to functions. It's affecting the emotional well-being, the mental well-being, the health of people in the village. So I'm talking an extreme case. And I really don't know where to start. I've talked to the police, and the police said responsibility, duty of care. They were very supportive. They talked to the manager who didn't change her ways. And there's been a cover-up that's gone all the way up to various directors. And I have now emails from 3 different directors, all with some form of gaslighting. And a lady from New South Wales found out about me, and she was actually on the television, and she reached out to me for help and had a different director, and he has used gaslighting. They have a fairly standard letter that they will send, and it has gobbledygook, trying to make it look like it's a legal letter with legal speaking in it,
yeah.
but it isn't at all. It's just them putting words. So the people in the village are relying on me because other people have been silenced, other people have been threatened, and I'm the only one who is being bold enough to speak up, and I need big support. They're getting away with a lot because they're in the process of being taken over by a Swedish company. So some things have been fixed because they want to present that this is a good village, but it's really not a safe place to live because of the bullying, threats, intimidation.
So I think it's perhaps that's the kind of thing that potentially you could, if you're able to make the trek down or even contact PCLC, we might be able to read those letters and interpret some of that legalese for you.
That would
so
be
I would
good.
suggest that you grab our details. But perhaps more generally and more broadly, what avenues are available for people who perhaps have concerns in relation to how they're being treated in a residential care or a retirement village?
Well, there certainly are avenues for you. You need to make sure that from what you've described, I agree with Will's comments that there's the gobbledygook that you described needs to be closely examined to see whether you do have a legal basis, and assuming you do, you need to have a lawyer representing you. Now, there are a couple of law firms, I'm sure the PCLC would do an excellent job as a first step for you. But there are a number of law firms that I'm aware of that that specialise in acting for the residents of retirement villages.
Oh, that would be excellent.
And
yeah, I
that's,
knew I
that's the
needed a
sort of
specialist.
assistance that I think you need. There may well be other
The state government also provides advocacy support through the Housing for the Aged Action Group. So I can make sure that Will would have those details and they could pass them on. I think it points, though, the experience that you've had when you read the report that I talked about in terms of the Retirement Villages Act. You won't be surprised that the most common issue that was raised by people that are living in villages was about maintenance and issues not being dealt with in a timely manner. So one of the most significant reforms that's being considered are changes to the complaints process and setting in place a new and a revised and updated process so that people can get much more timely access to resolution. So totally agree with John and Will. I think for yourself at the moment it's about seeking support through PCLC, but in the longer term, what you've explained is exactly the reason that there are proposed to be changes to the Act to streamline that whole process.
Okay, thank you everybody. We might close the forum there. It's 12:34. I'd like to thank the Mayor. I'd like to thank our speakers, Gerard, Meg and John. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. It's been very insightful. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for everyone attending at home. I'd like to also encourage you to complete the evaluation sheet if you haven't done so already, giving me the worst mark and giving the rest of the speakers the best marks. I'd also encourage you to go have a look, especially if you're seeking some advice about your own circumstances. Please go attend at the PCLC table over there. We also have people from Peninsula Health, I believe, who may also have some materials there for you. Please, I do encourage you to go over, grab that material, make sure that you've got the resources available for you to address any issues that you may have. Oh yes, of course. And please do leave your email for us as well. So if you've got feedback and you do wish. Also, if you want any of the presenters' slides. Thanks, Kirsten, for reminding me. So please do leave your email. If you do wish to have those slides, we can provide those to you. And thank you so much. And I'll just say one last round of applause to our speakers. Okay, thank you, everyone.
And everyone, just before you head off, there's also some sandwiches left over and there's some wraps.